Should Corneshia Butler still be alive today?
I would think so.
But for a bail bond and perhaps a fatally flawed personal decision, murder victim Corneshia Butler might still be alive. A City of South Fulton police lieutenant says Shakia Perkins has been charged with the murder of Corneshia Perkins, a mother of four, the suspect's wife. But records indicate that's not the first time Shakia Perkins has been charged with crimes victimizing Ms. Butler. That in October of 2021, a judge ordered bond totaling $70,000 for Shakia Perkins on charges of aggravated assault, criminal damage to property, terroristic threats, felony, and arson first degree. Conditions including must not come within 200 yards of victim.
We would not want to see an individual get out on such a low bond, given the history between these two individuals.
What does it take for a woman to finally say enough? For 31-year-old mother of four, Corneshia Butler, the answer came after months of threats, stalking, and even a restraining order that was supposed to protect her. She had done everything society tells victims to do, but the system did not move fast enough. On the afternoon of November 16, 2022, in a quiet Atlanta neighborhood, the air was ordinary, the kind of afternoon when the sound of kids playing, cars moving up and down the street, and neighbors returning home from work blended into background noise. But that familiar rhythm was broken by something no one could ignore. A sharp crack split the silence. Then another. Gunfire. Neighbors paused, unsettled, their minds trying to reconcile what their ears had heard. Calls to 911 followed within minutes, voices filled with unease, reporting gunshots from inside the home of a young mother who had once spoken proudly of making this her sanctuary. When officers arrived, the scene waiting for them was nothing short of devastating. Corneshia Butler was lying inside her home, fatally shot in the face. A place that had once symbolized her resilience and her triumph over hardship had become the stage of her final moment. Standing just feet away was her youngest toddler, too young to understand, too small to process the magnitude of what had just unfolded. A child who would carry the invisible scars of that moment for the rest of their life. This was not the work of a faceless intruder. It was not random, nor the result of chance. This was an act carried out by someone Corneshia knew intimately, someone she had once loved, someone who had once promised to protect her. It was her ex-girlfriend, Shakia "Shaki" Perkins, a woman whose affection had curdled into obsession, whose charm had twisted into control, and whose jealousy had finally become lethal. Welcome to True Crime Red Flag. Thank you to my amazing subscribers. May your families stay safe wherever you are. If you're new here, subscribe and like this video because we reveal the warning signs that so many people ignore until it's too late. To understand the tragedy of Corneshia Butler's death, we have to step back because the truth of this case is not just in the fatal moment itself. It's in the buildup, the missed warnings, the systemic failures, and the slow tightening of a cage that left Corneshia with fewer and fewer exits. This is a story about how love turned into possession, how red flags went unheeded, and how the structures meant to keep victims safe often collapse under the weight of bureaucracy and delay. Atlanta, Georgia in 2022 was a city of contrasts. On one hand, it pulsed with energy, a hub of culture, music, food, and art. Parks buzzed with families, restaurants thrived, murals adorned the walls, celebrating history and resilience. It was a city where ambition and creativity seemed to collide, drawing people from across the country who were seeking a new chapter. But beneath the surface of that vibrancy, Atlanta also carried a darker reality. Violent crime was climbing, particularly homicides. For residents, it meant an uneasy coexistence, the joy of community life and opportunity shadowed by the worry of sudden, unpredictable violence. For some, that fear came from the streets. For others, it lived much closer to home. For Corneshia, Atlanta was supposed to be a fresh start. Born and raised in Memphis, Tennessee, she was known for her charisma and warmth, the kind of personality that drew people in. Family members often described her as the glue, the person who held things together, who made sure birthdays were celebrated, who kept the circle intact. Life had not always been easy. She became a mother young, and for many, that might have meant the end of their dreams. But for Corneshia, motherhood was fuel. She didn't just live for herself, she lived for her children. 3 daughters and 1 son became her anchor. Every choice she made, every late night, every risk she took was for them. Her hustle was relentless, balancing multiple careers to create stability. By day, she worked as a registered tax preparer, fluent in the language of numbers and systems, offering a practical skill that kept her rooted in professionalism. By night, she was a licensed esthetician, using her creativity, her charisma, and her ability to connect with clients to build a different kind of livelihood. Together, these roles showed who she was: versatile, resilient, and unwilling to let obstacles dictate her future. In Atlanta, she bought a spacious 5-bedroom home, a sanctuary for her children, a legacy she wanted to leave behind. She celebrated it openly, sharing glimpses on social media, proud of what she had accomplished, proud of the space where her children could grow, play, and thrive. It wasn't just a house, it was a statement, a declaration that she had built something out of nothing, that she had turned struggle into foundation. But within the walls of that sanctuary, another story was unfolding, one that would eventually unravel everything she had built. In 2016, Corneshia met Shakia Perkins, often called Shaki. At first, it felt like love's promise was fulfilled. Shaki was attentive, charming, and supportive, the kind of partner who seemed to understand her, who made her feel seen and cherished. In those early months, it was intoxicating. The quick texts, the spontaneous gestures, the feeling of having someone on her side. Friends noticed how quickly things moved. Within a short time, the two were living together, projecting the image of a picture-perfect life. For Corneshia, who balanced so much responsibility, the idea of partnership must have felt like a relief, like maybe she didn't have to carry the weight alone. But underneath that charm, cracks began to appear. What started as small, almost dismissible signs of jealousy, questions about where she was, accusations of dishonesty, grew sharper over time. Shaki's attentiveness blurred into surveillance, her affection into possession. What might have felt flattering in the beginning soon turned suffocating, and the escalation didn't stop there. Arguments that began with words began to spill over into property destruction, threats, and violent outbursts. The volatility became harder to ignore, harder to excuse as stress or misunderstanding. Friends and family noticed Corneshia withdrawing, her once lively presence dimmed by the weight of fear and control. The woman who had always been the glue of the family now seemed to be caught in something she couldn't quite escape. This is where the red flags were no longer subtle. They were loud, they were dangerous, and they were visible. But as is so often the case, when victims are caught in cycles of control and abuse, leaving is not as simple as walking away. Love, fear, hope, and danger intertwine into a cage that closes in slowly, until the exits seem either too risky or too impossible to take. By late 2021, the cracks in Corneshia Butler's relationship with Shakia Perkins had become gaping wounds. What had once looked like passion was now openly violent, jealous, and controlling. And while those closest to Corneshia could see the fear building, it was the system, law enforcement, courts, bondsmen, and judges that would prove unable or unwilling to stop what was coming. September of that year marked the first chilling turning point. On a stretch of road that Corneshia had driven many times before, her routine commute turned into something out of a nightmare. Shaki's car appeared in the rearview mirror, weaving aggressively, closing the distance like a predator chasing prey. Witnesses later described the incident as deliberate. Corneshia wasn't just being followed, she was being hunted. As the vehicles raced side by side, Shaki swerved sharply, ramming into Corneshia's car, forcing her toward the shoulder. It wasn't an accident. It was an attempt to run her off the road, to cause not just fear, but serious harm, perhaps even death. Somehow, Corneshia managed to keep control of her vehicle. But the message was clear. There were no safe spaces anymore, not even behind the wheel of her car. That same month, the violence escalated further. Corneshia returned home one evening to find her sanctuary breached, the front door frame splintered, the marks of forced entry unmistakable. Shaki had come directly into her home, shattering the sense of safety Corneshia had built for her children. What should have been her fortress had been violated. The invasion wasn't just about access, it was about dominance, about proving that even inside her own walls, Corneshia could not escape. And then came the fire. Investigators would later confirm that the blaze consuming Corneshia's vehicles, including her distinctive pink Mercedes-Benz, was no accident. It was arson. Flames licked the night sky, thick smoke curling above the driveway as neighbors gathered in shock. For Corneshia, the destruction was more than material loss. It was a personal signature, a violent declaration that her abuser knew exactly how to strike where it hurt the most. A car is more than transportation. It's independence, mobility, freedom. To burn it was to send a message. You are trapped. You will not escape me. Suspicion immediately fell on Shaki, and yet the flames themselves were only another line in a growing file of violence that law enforcement struggled to connect into a coherent pattern. As if physical violence weren't enough, the words began to match the deeds. The text messages were chilling in their specificity. In one, Shaki promised that Corneshia would be dead, openly dismissing the consequences. Prison meant nothing compared to the satisfaction of vengeance. In another, the words were even sharper, more deliberate, impossible to dismiss as empty threats. She wrote that she was aiming for first degree, not second. It was not a vague outburst. It was a confession of intent, typed out in black and white. She was not threatening to scare Corneshia. She was mapping out her murder with precision. And still, Corneshia fought for survival the only way she knew how, by reaching out for help. Records show that she made call after call to the police. 13 times at least, she filed reports, begged for protection, and explained the danger she faced. She sought restraining orders, the very tool meant to create legal distance between abuser and victim. She did what survivors are told to do: document the threats, bring them to the attention of authorities, seek legal boundaries. Each call was a lifeline, a plea to a system designed, at least in theory, to protect. But what she encountered instead was the slow grind of bureaucracy, the inertia of a system that often reacts piecemeal, unable or unwilling to connect the dots. Because each time Shaki was arrested, the courts gave her a way back to the streets. Bail hearings, bond approvals, judicial leniency, each opened the door for her to return, more emboldened than before. To the system, these were individual events: a car accident here, a forced entry there, a vehicle fire, a threatening message. But to Corneshia, they were pieces of a single escalating puzzle. They weren't isolated, they were connected, each one building toward the next, each one sharpening the likelihood that one day the threats would become reality. This is the tragic failure of domestic violence response in so many cases. Authorities often look at single incidents, measuring them against statutes and precedents. Was the fire arson? Was the break-in burglary? Was the text just bluster or a credible threat? But for victims, these questions are irrelevant. They know the pattern. They feel the escalation in their bones. The fear is not academic. It is lived daily, moment to moment. Corneshia knew she was in danger. She told the system repeatedly, but the system kept resetting the clock each time, starting from scratch, treating her as a petitioner for each individual crime, instead of as a woman whose life was visibly, increasingly in jeopardy. And each time Shaki walked free, the terror deepened. Because what does freedom mean to a perpetrator who has already promised to kill? It means validation. It means the system has signaled that the consequences will not outweigh the rage. Corneshia's family would later speak of how hard she tried to maintain normalcy in spite of it all. She refused to let terror rob her of joy. She had built a life in Atlanta for her children, and she clung to it even as the shadows crept closer. As the year drew to a close, she decorated her new home for the holidays. Lights went up. The anticipation of Thanksgiving filled her plans. For the first time in her new sanctuary, she would host her children around the table, determined to create a memory untouched by violence. She wanted them to feel warmth, to feel celebration, to feel like a family rising above struggle. It is haunting to picture her in those moments, arranging decorations, planning meals, perhaps imagining the laughter of her children filling the house, while at the same time fielding threats that told her, in no uncertain terms, that someone was plotting her end. The contrast is almost unbearable. The resilience of a mother refusing to let fear define her children's holidays against the reality of a partner who was escalating toward murder. This is what it means to live under the shadow of domestic violence, to smile in front of your children while glancing over your shoulder, to prepare for Thanksgiving while wondering if you will see Christmas, to put up lights while wondering if the person who once claimed to love you is sitting in their car outside, watching, waiting, and all the while, the system recorded her pleas. 13 calls, police reports, restraining orders. Each one should have been a thread woven into a net, strong enough to catch what was coming. Instead, the threads were left loose, fraying, treated as paperwork to be filed rather than as red flags waving in unison. The truth of this stage of her life is as clear as it is devastating. She was not just a woman in a turbulent relationship. She was a woman under siege. She was targeted in her car, in her home, in her driveway, and even on her phone. She had the courage to seek help again and again, but the system treated her courage as formality rather than urgency. And that cycle of violence escalating, of calls for help answered with release after release, would become the direct pipeline to her final day. It was the afternoon of November 16, 2022, when the cycle of violence that had been building for more than a year finally reached its breaking point. Inside Corneshia Butler's Atlanta home, the tension was thick, the kind of atmosphere where every word carried weight, where silence felt dangerous. By now, Corneshia was exhausted from the threats, the destruction, the endless cycle of fear. And for the first time, she made it clear, this relationship was over. The confrontation began like so many others had, with words sharpened into weapons. But this time, Corneshia stood her ground. Witnesses would later say she was done hiding, done caving to threats. Her voice carried a finality that Shaki had never heard before. The relationship, whatever it once had been, was finished. But leaving a controlling partner is never just about words. For the abuser, it is about power. And when power slips away, desperation grows. Shaki stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. For a moment, the silence seemed to offer relief, but that relief was deceptive because Shaki did not leave. Security footage later confirmed what happened next. She walked to her car, parked nearby, and opened the door. Reaching inside, she retrieved a 9mm handgun. The act was deliberate, chilling in its clarity. She didn't need to break in. She didn't need to stalk from the shadows. She was making a decision to turn the threats she had so often voiced into reality. She walked back toward the house, weapon in hand. Inside, Corneshia had no way of knowing what was about to happen. She may have thought the argument was over. She may have believed for just a moment that the worst had passed. But when Shaki re-entered that home, it was with deadly purpose. Gunshots rang out just after 6 p.m. The cracks shattered the quiet of the neighborhood, echoing down the block. Neighbors, startled and afraid, grabbed their phones. 911 calls flooded in. Concerned voices told dispatchers they had heard shots, that something terrible had just happened inside the house where Corneshia lived with her children. When officers arrived, the sight waiting for them was devastating. In the living room, beneath the glow of holiday decorations she had proudly hung, Corneshia lay fatally wounded. A gunshot to the face, ending the life she had fought so hard to protect. The scene was not random. It was not the chaos of a robbery gone wrong or a crime of opportunity. It was intimate, personal, targeted. In the midst of that horror, another sight broke the hearts of even seasoned officers. Corneshia's youngest toddler was standing nearby, physically unharmed but traumatized, bearing witness to the unimaginable. Officers rushed the child out of the home, but the image would linger, a mother's last moments unfolding only feet from her child, a memory that no one that young should ever have to carry. For neighbors, the tragedy confirmed the unease they had felt for months. Many had noticed the arguments, the tension, the suspicious car that circled the block too often. On that day, some reported seeing a vehicle parked near the house, lingering, as if waiting. Others said they had heard the raised voices before the shots. The signs had been there, but now they were undeniable. Forensic investigators combed the scene carefully. Shell casings confirmed the weapon, a 9mm handgun, the same caliber police would later recover. The evidence spoke clearly. This was no accident. This was an execution carried out by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. It didn't take long for suspicion to focus on one name. Family members and neighbors told officers immediately. Shakia Perkins. They knew the history. They knew the threats. They knew that if Corneshia was gone, there was only one person who could have wanted it this way. Police turned to the file already thick with reports. 13 calls for help, restraining orders, arson investigations, text messages that read like a blueprint for murder. Each page added weight to the conclusion. This was not spontaneous. This was premeditated, and the digital trail sealed the case. Cell phone data placed Shaky at the crime scene at the time of the shooting. There was no question. Her phone pinged off towers that mapped her presence with precision, and within an hour of the murder, that same phone traced her path to her sister's apartment complex across town. It was a trail that could not be erased. Tactical units were deployed to the complex. With caution, they surrounded the building. Officers moved in with weapons drawn, aware that the suspect they were about to encounter was armed and had already proven willing to kill. But when they found her, Shaky surrendered without resistance. The arrest was calm, almost anticlimactic compared to the violence she had unleashed only hours before. Body camera footage from the arrest captured her demeanor. She muttered statements, vague attempts to deflect blame, as though she could rewrite the narrative in the moment of capture. But the evidence told a different story, one that was irrefutable. Inside her car, investigators found everything they needed to prove premeditation beyond doubt. The 9mm handgun lay there, matching the casings found at the scene. Alongside it, a notebook with handwritten notes, meticulous details of Corneshia's daily routines, her comings and goings, the rhythms of her life tracked like prey. It was stalking documented on paper, proof that the obsession had been calculated, planned. On her phone, the digital evidence was even more damning. Investigators uncovered a draft text message, never sent but waiting in her device. The words were chilling. "It's done now. You can't leave me again." A confession written in advance, as if she had scripted the aftermath of her own crime. Proof that this was not a moment of passion, not a split-second loss of control. It was deliberate. It was planned. For the investigators, the case was clear. For the family, the loss was unbearable. And for the community, the tragedy was enraging. Because none of this was unpredictable. None of it was without warning. The signs had been there for months. The threats had been explicit. The violence had been documented. And yet the system allowed Shaki to remain free long enough to carry out the murder she had promised in her own words. This is where the failures become impossible to ignore. Restraining orders, police reports, arson investigations, all of them pieces of a puzzle that should have triggered decisive action. But instead they became paperwork, treated separately, disconnected. The courts granted bond again and again, never fully weighing the cumulative danger. The result was fatal. And so the holiday decorations glowed in the background as crime scene photos were taken, stark reminders of what Corneshia had been trying to build. A home filled with joy, a space safe for her children, a legacy of resilience. In the end, those lights shone not on celebration but on tragedy. The arrest of Shakia Perkins confirmed what Corneshia had feared all along. The threats were real, the danger was escalating, and the system had failed to protect her, despite every opportunity to intervene. In the weeks after the murder, as the grief settled heavy over her family and community, the wheels of justice began to turn. The prosecution built its case meticulously, presenting not just the crime of November 16th, but the entire timeline of escalating violence that had led to it. Jurors were shown the photographs of Corneshia's burned Mercedes-Benz, the reports of her car being rammed, the door frame splintered from forced entry, the threatening text messages written in black and white. They saw the arson reports. They heard about the restraining orders. And then they heard the most damning evidence of all, Shakey's own words, messages promising Corneshia would die, vowing she was aiming for first degree, not second. Forensic analysts walked the jury through the ballistics. Shell casings from the living room matched the 9mm handgun recovered from Shakey's car. Cell tower data placed her phone at Corneshia's home at the exact time of the shooting. And then there was the draft text found on her phone, chilling in its simplicity. "It's done now. You can't leave me again." Proof beyond any doubt that this was premeditated. But facts alone were not the most powerful part of the trial. It was the voices of those left behind. Friends, neighbors, and family took the stand to describe the fear Corneshia lived under, the constant shadow that loomed over her despite her efforts to stay strong. Her sister spoke of late-night phone calls, where Corneshia whispered her worries. Neighbors described hearing the arguments, the pounding on the door, the sounds of escalating rage. And then came the victim impact statements, words from her children that pierced the silence of the courtroom. They spoke not only of their loss, but of the hole left in their lives, the laughter missing from their home, the milestones their mother would never witness. Jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the full weight of the loss pressed down. The defense tried to paint a different picture. They argued that Shaki had been emotionally unstable, that the shooting was not premeditated, but the result of a sudden outburst. They attempted to recast the notebook of Corneshia's routines as meaningless scribbles, the text messages as empty bluster. But the evidence was overwhelming. This was not instability. It was obsession. It was calculation. The jury didn't take long. After less than a day of deliberation, they returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts. First-degree murder, possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, cruelty to children for forcing Corneshia's toddler to witness the crime. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the courtroom, there was a sense of relief, but not peace. Justice in the legal sense had been served, but as her sister Tariq later said, no sentence could bring Corneshia back. No verdict could erase the trauma burned into the memory of her children. True justice, the kind that restores, was impossible. Outside the courtroom, the community gathered in vigils. Candles flickered against the night as friends and strangers alike came to remember a woman who had been the glue of her family, who had fought so hard to create a better life. On social media, tributes poured in, photographs of Corneshia smiling with her children, clips of her celebrating milestones, and words describing her kindness, her determination, her resilience. She was remembered not only as a victim, but as a mother, a sister, a friend, a woman whose light had been stolen, but whose story would not be forgotten. But alongside the tributes came anger at a system that had failed her so completely. At a press conference, Atlanta Police Chief Keith Meadows spoke candidly. His officers had done their jobs, he said. They had arrested Shaki multiple times. They had filed the reports. They had answered the calls. But the courts had released her again and again, granting bond despite the escalating violence. The district attorney's office had opposed those bonds, warning of the danger, but the warnings had been ignored. The result was now carved into reality. The case became more than a personal tragedy. It became a symbol of systemic failure, a reminder of how domestic violence cases are too often treated as isolated incidents, rather than as part of a clear and escalating pattern. A reminder of how paperwork and procedure can blind the system to the reality of imminent danger. A reminder of how victims who do everything right, who call, who report, who file, can still be left vulnerable when the system refuses to connect the dots. And then came the funeral. The church was overflowing, packed with family, friends, and community members who had come to mourn and to celebrate. Photographs of Corneshia lined the entryway, showing her in happier times, holding her children, flashing her radiant smile. The service was filled with both sorrow and joy. Sorrow for a life cut short, joy for the love and light she had given while she was here. Voices rose in prayer and song, lifting her memory even as tears fell. It was a reminder that even in death, Corneshia remained what she had always been, the glue that brought people together. But funerals also leave us with questions, and the question hanging in the air was this: how could this have been prevented? The signs were clear, the warnings were documented, the red flags were waving long before that November afternoon. Yet the system moved too slowly, too narrowly, failing to see the pattern until it was too late. And so, as this story closes, it cannot end with silence. It must end with a call to action. If someone you love comes to you with fear in their voice, believe them. If they say they are in danger, listen. If they tell you about threats, destruction, or stalking, do not dismiss it as drama or exaggeration. These are red flags. These are warnings, and silence in the face of them is not neutral. It is deadly. Demand more from the systems meant to protect. Push for laws and courts that recognize patterns of escalation instead of treating each incident in isolation. Hold leaders accountable for connecting the dots before it is too late. And above all, support victims when they reach out. Too often, they are told to endure, to stay quiet, to handle it privately. But Corneshia's story shows us what silence can cost. She did everything she could to protect herself and her children. She sought help, she filed the reports, and still she was left unprotected. That is not just her tragedy. That is our collective responsibility. Her life should not be reduced to the way it ended. It should be remembered for her strength, her resilience, her love for her children, and the legacy she built against all odds. But it should also be a warning, a testament to what happens when red flags are ignored. So tonight, as you finish this story, carry her memory with you. Speak her name, share her story. Let her life and her loss remind you of the cost of silence. This is True Crime Red Flag. Thank you to my amazing subscribers. May your families stay safe wherever you are. If you are new here, subscribe, like, and share this video, because every time we tell these stories, every time we name the red flags, we make it just a little harder for another tragedy like this to unfold unnoticed.